King Kong, who's the greatest heavyweight of all time, in your opinion? Who's number one?
El mejor boxeador peso completo en tu opinión. Lennox Lewis.
¿Por qué?
That's the question. Fue uno de los boxeadores que yo empecé a ver heavyweight, técnico, tiene su...
Fuerte.
Sabiendo que hay muchos otros, porque cada cual en su etapa, cada cual en su tiempo.
He feels Lennox dominated in range and distance with the jab. Obviously there's a lot of them. It's just his opinion, but he feels that for a big man, he was extremely dominant and knew how to use that very well, and he loves Lennox.
¿Cómo estás, campeón? ¿Feliz?
Those are the words of Luis King Kong Ortiz. Shout out to Ellie Setback for getting the interview, and he asked Luis Ortiz who was his favorite heavyweight. He gave it to Lennox Lewis, and I can't argue with that, and I can see why Lennox Lewis is a lot of people's favorite, because Lennox Lewis was a guy that, even though he wasn't the most popular, he was probably the most best technically. With far as aggression, long distance, mid-range, power, overall ring generalship, he was probably the best at what he did, especially in his era, okay? Because the guy did a lot of upsets. He knocked a lot of people off. He took on Klitschko, even though I think that Klitschko fight should have been ran back. That was one hell of a fight. And that was Lennox Lewis's last fight, mind you. And Lennox Lewis, I feel, is one of the best. It's easy to see what type of fighter Lennox Lewis is versus what he would do to today's heavyweights, okay, currently. And I think he would give all of them a run for their money. He would knock out Deontay Wilder, more than likely Joshua too. Tyson Fury would probably be someone more difficult, but then again, I look at it this way. Lennox Lewis fighting Tyson Fury, I think Tyson Fury hasn't been in there with someone like Lennox Lewis. And the Klitschkos don't count, especially Vladimir. Vladimir doesn't fight like Lennox Lewis. Lennox Lewis had a heavy right hand, a right uppercut that will take you out, a left uppercut, a left hook, the jab. He had so many weapons, and he wasn't tentative like Vladimir Klitschko. So, the question is, who would win between him and Tyson Fury? Tyson Fury more than likely would be defeated, especially if that same Tyson Fury came in, the heavy-handed one in fights 2 and 3. Now, credit to Tyson Fury, though. We have to keep it a buck. Tyson Fury did not fight Deontay Wilder like he fought Dillian Whyte. He was more on his feet. He was fast. He was quicker. He was more like something like a hybrid. He had the power still, but he was still able to, you know what I mean? And he was able to get in and get out. And he showed us that he had the ability to be more elusive, versus him and Wilder. I don't think with Wilder he needed to, because unfortunately for Wilder, I think he gained too much weight, and I think he wasn't as nimble and as flexible as he used to be, especially when the first time they fought, okay? But Tyson Fury has the ability to switch it up. Now, the question is, could Tyson Fury deal with Lennox Lewis? Shout out to Spencer Farron. Spencer Farron said that Luis Ortiz used to spar with Lennox Lewis. You know what I mean? And if that tells you Lennox Lewis's last fight was like in 2003 or something like that, it was over 20 years ago. So that lets you know, and it depends on how old he was how old he was when he was sparring. And then you add the 20 some odd years or whatever, right? Or almost 20 years, on top of that. So, if Lennox Lewis and Luis Ortiz did some sparring together, Luis Ortiz definitely would know if Lennox Lewis is technical and better, because he shared the ring with him. Okay? So a lot of people have to understand Luis Ortiz is a very technical fighter himself, being a southpaw. So if he was in there at Lennox Lewis, you know what I mean? And he's more than likely learned that personally. Okay? Based on what Spencer told me, because that's what he said Lennox Lewis told him, like, yo, he used to spar with Lennox Lewis. You guys were there. I mean, he literally said that. So yeah, Luis Ortiz, picking Lennox Lewis now makes perfect sense, But then again, I mean, who could argue with Lennox Lewis being one of the best, And of course, this is Luis Ortiz's opinion, but someone hard hitting as dangerous as Luis Ortiz, regardless of the age, he's still, for him to pick Lennox Lewis, that's quite an honor. Okay, because Luis Ortiz is still a bad mother sucker, and for Lennox Lewis to wow him is a big deal. But anyway, you guys tell me what you think of Luis Ortiz choosing Lennox Lewis, the best heavyweight of all time. Of course, please subscribe, and you guys been Counterpunch. Peace!